In a world where dreams can make you a target and favor can turn into betrayal, one young man learned that destiny is often born in the darkest places. Before he wore the robes of power, he was stripped and thrown into a pit. Before he ruled a nation, he was sold like property. Before his name was spoken in the courts of kings, it was whispered in chains and forgotten in prison. This is not merely a story of success, it is a story of waiting, of faith tested by silence, of a God who works behind the scenes when everything appears lost. Tonight, we journey through betrayal and bondage, through dreams deferred and hope restored, to uncover the life of a man whose suffering saved nations. This is Joseph, a slave who became a ruler, a dreamer who trusted God when the dream seemed buried, and a life that proves, what humans intend for evil, God can turn for good. Joseph was born into a family already fractured by rivalry, longing, and unhealed wounds. He entered the world not as the firstborn, nor as the strongest, but as the son of Jacob's old age, born to Rachel, the woman Jacob had loved above all others. From the beginning, Joseph's life was marked by preference, and in the ancient world of patriarchs, preference was never harmless. Jacob's love for Joseph was visible, undeniable, and costly. In a household governed by hierarchy and honor, favoritism disrupted balance. Joseph's brothers, sons of Leah, Bilhah, and Zilpah, had grown up competing not only for inheritance, but for affection. They labored in the fields, bore responsibility, and carried the weight of survival. Joseph, younger and sheltered, became the living reminder that love was not equally distributed. The coat Jacob gave Joseph was more than a garment, it was a statement. Whether ornate or long-sleeved, it marked distinction. It suggested authority without effort, elevation without trial. To Joseph's brothers, it symbolized everything they feared, that the youngest would rise above them, not through merit, but through affection. Joseph did not yet understand the danger of being favored. Young and unseasoned, he moved within the household unaware of the resentment growing around him. Scripture records that he brought bad reports of his brothers to their father, not necessarily out of malice, but immaturity. In a family already tense, his words deepened the divide. He did not yet know when silence was wisdom. Then came the dreams. In the ancient Near East, dreams were not dismissed as imagination. They were feared, weighed, interpreted. Dreams were believed to carry divine messages, especially when repeated. Joseph's dreams were vivid, symbolic, and unsettling. In the first dream, sheaves of grain stood upright while the sheaves of his brothers bowed down before his own. In the second, the sun, moon, and 11 stars bowed before him. Joseph did not cloak the meaning. He spoke plainly. He shared what he saw, not realizing that revelation without discernment can become provocation. To his brothers, the dreams were not innocent, they were claims of supremacy. To Jacob, the second dream disturbed even him, yet Scripture says he kept the matter in mind. Jacob had encountered God through dreams before. He recognized a familiar pattern. Joseph, however, stood at the threshold between calling and consequence. His brothers' jealousy hardened into hatred. They no longer spoke peaceably to him. The household became divided not by external threat, but by internal ambition and wounded pride. The seeds of betrayal were sown long before any action was taken. In this environment, Joseph's identity began to form. He believed the dreams. He trusted that God had shown him something true. But belief without understanding can become vulnerability. Joseph had not yet learned that destiny often unfolds through suffering, not elevation. Jacob, unaware of how close the fracture had come to breaking, sent Joseph to check on his brothers as they pastured the flocks near Shechem. It was an ordinary request, but it would lead Joseph beyond the safety of his father's tents and into the open field, where jealousy no longer whispered, but waited. As Joseph approached from a distance, the brothers saw him. The coat identified him before his face did. And in that moment, the dreams returned to their minds not as prophecy, but as threat. Their resentment found a voice. Here comes the dreamer. What followed would not be an accident. It would be a choice born from years of silent comparison, unresolved anger, and fear of displacement. The brothers conspired not merely to harm Joseph, but to silence the future they believed he represented. Joseph walked toward them unaware that the protection of his father no longer surrounded him. He stepped into the space where calling meets cost, where innocence collides with human cruelty. The dreams that promised elevation would first lead him downward. And so, before Joseph ever became a slave, before Egypt ever heard his name, before prison or palace, his story entered its darkest turn not at the hands of strangers, but through the betrayal of blood. Joseph did not arrive among his brothers as an intruder. He came as a son sent by his father, carrying concern rather than command. Yet concern is often indistinguishable from authority when jealousy has already taken root. From the moment his brothers saw him approaching across the open land, the past years of resentment sharpened into decision. The coat he wore visible long before his face became a symbol they could no longer tolerate. It was no longer just fabric. It was a reminder of preference, of dreams spoken too boldly, of a future they feared would erase their own place in the family. The words they spoke among themselves were not impulsive. They were calculated, spoken by men who had lived for years under comparison. "Here comes the dreamer," they said, and in that sentence lay contempt and challenge. To destroy Joseph, they believed, was to destroy the dreams themselves. If the dreamer disappeared, so would the prophecy that haunted them. Reuben, the firstborn, heard their intent and was troubled. His position as eldest still carried a sense of responsibility, even if his authority had been weakened by past failure. He did not argue for Joseph's innocence, nor did he confront the hatred directly. Instead, he sought delay. He suggested the pit not as a final act, but as a pause. He intended to return later and rescue the boy, restoring him quietly to their father and reclaiming some measure of lost honor. So they seized Joseph. The stripping of the coat was the first act of violence. Before the pit, before the abandonment, there was humiliation. The garment that had distinguished him was torn away, leaving him exposed and powerless. In that moment, Joseph's identity shifted. He was no longer the favored son, approaching his brothers with trust. He was a captive, surrounded by faces he recognized but could not read. The pit was empty of water, but not empty of threat. Its depth was enough to trap, its darkness enough to terrify. When they threw him in, they did not merely restrain him, they erased him from sight. Joseph's cries echoed upward, unanswered. For the first time, the dreams felt distant, even absurd. The sun and moon that had bowed in his vision now seemed impossibly far away. Above the pit, his brother sat down to eat. This detail is not incidental. It reveals the state of their hearts. They were not in a frenzy. They were composed enough to share a meal while their brother suffered below. The act of eating signaled emotional distance, a deliberate choice to normalize betrayal. Hunger was satisfied while conscience was quieted. Time passed. Reuben was gone, perhaps tending to the flocks or separating himself to avoid complicity. In his absence, the situation changed. A caravan appeared on the horizon. Midianite traders, Ishmaelites on their way to Egypt, carrying spices, balm, and myrrh. Egypt was the great power of the region, a land of wealth and opportunity, but also of slavery. For those sold into its markets, return was unlikely. Judah saw the caravan and spoke. His words reframed the moment. "What profit is it if we kill our brother and conceal his blood?" he asked. It was not a plea for mercy, it was a calculation. Murder would cost them. Selling Joseph would gain them silver and remove him permanently. The proposal carried a moral disguise. Joseph would live. Their hands would not be stained with blood. Yet survival in chains is not mercy, it is exile. The brothers agreed. Joseph was pulled from the pit, not rescued, but transferred. The ground he stood on was no longer his own. The traders inspected him as merchandise, not as a son of Israel. For 20 pieces of silver, the price of a slave, Joseph was handed over. The transaction was swift, efficient, and final. As the caravan moved on, Joseph watched his brothers recede into the distance. No explanation was given, no farewell spoken. The faces he had known since childhood turned away. In that silence, something broke that could never be fully restored. Trust was not merely wounded, it was removed from the world he had known. When Reuben returned and found the pit empty, panic seized him. His plan had failed. Joseph was gone. The firstborn tore his clothes in grief and fear, not only for Joseph but for himself. He knew what this meant for their father. He knew the cost would not be paid by silver alone. The brothers devised a lie that would hold. They took Joseph's coat, dipped it in the blood of a goat, and sent it to Jacob. They did not speak the lie directly. They let the evidence speak for them. "We found this," they said. "Please identify whether it is your son's robe or not." Jacob recognized it immediately. The grief that followed was devastating. Jacob tore his garments, put on sackcloth, and mourned for many days. His sons and daughters tried to comfort him, but he refused consolation. He believed Joseph was dead, torn apart by wild animals. The lie worked, but it chained the brothers to guilt that would follow them for years. Meanwhile, Joseph was being carried farther from home with every step. The road to Egypt was long, and with each mile, the life he had known dissolved. The language around him changed. The customs shifted. The God of his fathers spoken of intense, and altars felt distant in a land of foreign gods. Joseph was no longer a dreamer among brothers. He was a slave among strangers, yet Scripture does not say that God abandoned him. This is the turning point that defines Joseph's story. Not the dreams, not the betrayal, but the hidden presence of God in motion. The covenant made with Abraham did not depend on location. The God who spoke in Canaan was not confined by borders. Though Joseph was carried against his will, he was not carried beyond God's reach. Joseph entered Egypt as property, not person. His future was no longer his own. He would be bought, assigned, and commanded. Every right he once assumed was gone. And yet, this descent was not meaningless. It was the beginning of preparation. The dreams had promised elevation, but they did not explain the path. Now the path revealed itself through loss, displacement, and silence. Joseph would have to learn obedience before authority, humility before leadership, and faith before fulfillment. The pit stripped him of pride, that the sail stripped him of security. Egypt would strip him of familiarity, but none of these would strip him of purpose. The betrayal by his brothers closed one chapter of his life, but it opened another one that would test not only his character, but his understanding of God. The God who had shown him dreams would now teach him patience. The God who had revealed the future would now shape the man who would carry it. As the caravan disappeared into Egypt's gates, Joseph's story moved from family conflict to imperial destiny. The stage widened, the cost deepened, and the hand of God, though unseen, remained active. Joseph had been sold as a slave, but the story was far from finished. Joseph entered Egypt without ceremony. There was no record of his arrival, no acknowledgement of his past, no interest in his future beyond usefulness. He was one slave among many, carried into a land whose language, gods, and customs were foreign to him. Egypt did not ask who he had been, it only measured what he could do. He was sold again, this time into the household of Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, captain of the guard. Potiphar was not merely a soldier, he was part of the inner machinery of power. His estate reflected order, wealth, and authority. For Joseph, this environment represented both danger and opportunity. A slave's survival depended on obedience, but a slave's advancement depended on trust. Scripture tells us something remarkable at this point. The Lord was with Joseph. This statement appears quietly, without explanation, yet it alters the entire meaning of what follows. God's presence did not remove Joseph from servitude, it transformed the conditions within it. Joseph did not prosper because he manipulated the system. He prospered because integrity, diligence, and discernment accompanied him, and these qualities attracted attention even in a pagan household. Joseph worked faithfully. He learned quickly. He observed the rhythms of Egyptian life and adapted without abandoning his identity. He did not rebel against his position, nor did he collapse under it. He allowed the discipline of servitude to refine him. In time, Potiphar noticed. Responsibility was given incrementally. First small tasks, then oversight of others, then authority over resources. Joseph did not demand advancement. It arrived as trust accumulated. Potiphar eventually placed everything he owned under Joseph's care. The household prospered not because of Egyptian gods, but because of the blessing carried by a Hebrew slave. Potiphar recognized this. He did not understand the God of Israel, but he understood results. The success of his estate was undeniable. Joseph became steward over the house, trusted with management, logistics, and decision-making. For the first time since leaving his father's home, Joseph held authority again. But this authority came without protection. Joseph was young, capable, and Scripture notes his appearance. In an environment of power and privilege, visibility invited attention. Potiphar's wife noticed him. What began as observation became desire. Her advances were direct, repeated, and persistent. This was not a momentary temptation. It was a prolonged assault on Joseph's integrity. Each day she spoke to him. Each day he refused. His refusal was not vague or evasive. It was reasoned and resolute. He reminded her that Potiphar trusted him completely, withholding nothing except her. He acknowledged the injustice such an act would bring upon his master, and then he spoke words that revealed the depth of his character. How then could I do this great wickedness and sin against God? Joseph's loyalty was not merely professional, it was theological. He understood that sin does not require witnesses to exist. Egypt might excuse the act, power might conceal it, but God would see. Joseph's moral compass had not been dismantled by exile, it had been sharpened by it. Eventually, the pressure escalated. One day, when the house was empty, Potiphar's wife seized Joseph by his garment and demanded he lie with her. In that moment, Joseph chose loss over compromise. He fled, leaving the garment behind. Escape cost him everything he had gained. The garment became evidence. Just as his brothers had used a garment dipped in blood to deceive their father, another garment now became a tool of accusation. Potiphar's wife reversed the narrative. She accused Joseph of attempted assault, framing herself as victim and him as aggressor. Potiphar was enraged. The text does not describe an investigation. It does not record Joseph's defense. Power did not require proof. A slave's word could not outweigh the claim of a noblewoman. Potiphar had to act not only out of anger but to preserve honor. Joseph was cast into prison. Once again, dissent followed faithfulness. Integrity did not protect him from consequence. Obedience did not shield him from injustice. Joseph's reward for resisting sin was confinement. Yet Scripture repeats the same quiet refrain. The Lord was with Joseph. Prison in Egypt was not merely a holding cell. It was a place for political offenders, those whose presence was inconvenient or dangerous. Joseph was placed under the authority of the warden, surrounded by men broken by power struggles far above their reach. In this darkness, Joseph's character remained consistent. He did not retreat into bitterness. He did not abandon responsibility. He served faithfully, even without hope of release. And once again, trust followed. The warden noticed Joseph's reliability. Soon, Joseph was placed in charge of other prisoners. Even in confinement, order followed him. Structure emerged where chaos had reigned. The blessing that had marked Potiphar's house now marked the prison. This pattern was unmistakable. Joseph's circumstances changed repeatedly, but his conduct did not. Whether favored son, slave, steward, or prisoner, the same principles governed him. He worked as if God were present because he was. The dreams that had once promised dominance now seemed distant echoes. Joseph did not cling to them. He did not demand their fulfillment. He endured. Potiphar's house had tested Joseph's integrity and prosperity. Prison would test his patience in delay. And in the shadows of confinement, where influence was limited and hope restrained, God was preparing Joseph for something far greater than personal vindication. He was being shaped to understand power without corruption, authority without entitlement, and trust without visibility. Joseph's story had not stalled. It was descending deliberately into a place where character is forged beyond observation. And it was there, among prisoners and forgotten men, that the next movement of destiny would begin. The prison did not feel like a pause in Joseph's life. It felt like erasure. Days passed without marker or meaning, measured only by routine and restraint. The authority Joseph had earned in Potiphar's house vanished without appeal, replaced by iron doors and the dull certainty that his fate rested entirely in the hands of others. He had done nothing to deserve this, and yet injustice had found him again. Still, the presence of God did not depart. Joseph adapted to confinement as he had adapted to slavery. He learned the rhythms of the prison, the patterns of despair etched into the men around him. These were not petty criminals. Many were former officials, men who had lived close to Pharaoh's power and fallen suddenly from favor. Their silence was heavy with betrayal, their eyes trained on a future that no longer belonged to them. Joseph listened, he observed, he served. The warden trusted him, not because Joseph demanded authority, but because responsibility followed him naturally. Soon, Joseph oversaw the daily life of the prison. He was not free, but he was useful. And usefulness became the unexpected doorway through which God would speak again. Two men entered the prison whose presence altered the atmosphere immediately. They were the chief cupbearer and the chief baker of Pharaoh, officers of high rank who had offended the king. Their fall from power was abrupt, unexplained, and absolute. In a culture where Pharaoh was considered divine, such offenses were dangerous. Their imprisonment carried both fear and uncertainty. Joseph noticed them one morning. He observed that their faces were troubled. This detail is crucial. Even in captivity, Joseph remained attentive to others. He did not retreat into self-pity. He did not become hardened. He asked a simple question. Why do you look so sad today? This question reopened the door of destiny. Both men had dreams, disturbing, vivid, and unresolved. Dreams in prison carried particular weight. With no access to court interpreters or priests, their meanings felt sealed. The men believed the dreams mattered, but had no one to explain them. Joseph spoke carefully. Do not interpretations belong to God, he said. He did not claim power. He redirected authority upward. Only then did he invite them to speak. The cupbearer's dream came first. He described a vine with 3 branches that budded, blossomed, and produced grapes. He pressed the grapes into Pharaoh's cup and placed it in the king's hand. Joseph listened, then interpreted with confidence. The dream meant restoration. Within 3 days, the cupbearer would be reinstated to his position. The baker, encouraged, shared his dream. He described 3 baskets of bread on his head, with birds eating from the top basket. Joseph's interpretation this time was grim. Within 3 days, the baker would be executed, and his body left exposed. Joseph did not soften the message. Faithfulness required honesty. Both interpretations came to pass exactly as spoken. The cupbearer was restored. The baker was hanged. Joseph's gift was confirmed not as speculation, but as revelation. In that moment, Joseph saw a possible path forward. Before the cupbearer left, Joseph spoke for himself for the first time in years. He explained that he had been kidnapped from his homeland and imprisoned unjustly. He asked one thing: remember me when it goes well with you. It was not a demand, it was a hope. The cupbearer returned to Pharaoh's court, restored to favor, back among power and memory. Joseph remained in prison, and the cupbearer forgot him. 2 full years passed. This span of time is often overlooked, but it is essential. 2 years of silence. 2 years without explanation. 2 years where Joseph's last visible connection to deliverance vanished. The man who could speak his name in Pharaoh's presence chose not to walk, simply failed to remember. In Scripture, forgetting is not always cruelty. Sometimes it is part of delay. Joseph continued to serve. He continued to wait. There is no record of complaint, no lament preserved. The dreams he had interpreted had come true. His own dreams remained unfulfilled. Then Pharaoh dreamed. These dreams troubled Egypt itself. Pharaoh saw 7 healthy cows consumed by 7 gaunt ones, yet the thin cows did not grow fat. He saw 7 full ears of grain swallowed by 7 thin ears scorched by the east wind. He awoke disturbed. His magicians and wise men could not interpret the dreams. This was the moment memory returned. The cupbearer remembered Joseph. He spoke of the Hebrew prisoner who had interpreted dreams accurately in the prison. Pharaoh listened. In desperation, he sent for Joseph. Joseph was brought up from the dungeon quickly. He was shaved, clothed, and brought before the most powerful man in the world. Years of waiting collapsed into a single summons. Joseph stood before Pharaoh not as a dreamer boy, not as a steward, not as a prisoner, but as a man prepared by obscurity. Pharaoh spoke of his dreams. Joseph listened, and once again he deflected authority. "It is not in me," he said. God will give Pharaoh an answer of peace. The dreams were interpreted as one message. 7 years of abundance would come upon Egypt, followed by 7 years of severe famine. The famine would be so devastating that the abundance would be forgotten. Joseph did more than interpret. He advised. He spoke of storage, preparation, and leadership. In that moment, Joseph stepped into the role his life had been shaping him for, but elevation had not yet occurred. This was still transition. The dungeon doors had opened, but destiny had not yet fully arrived. Joseph had been forgotten by men, but he had not been forgotten by God. And now, the silence was about to end. Joseph did not step into Pharaoh's presence as a man seeking rescue. He stood as one summoned to serve. The years of silence had trained him not to grasp for advantage, not to posture for favor. When Pharaoh spoke, Joseph listened. When Joseph answered, he spoke with clarity shaped by suffering and restraint. Pharaoh had heard the interpretation, but now he heard something rarer: wisdom beyond the dream. Joseph explained not only what would happen, but what must be done. The abundance was not a reward, it was a warning. 7 years of plenty would test Egypt more than the famine itself. Without preparation, surplus would become waste, and waste would become regret. Joseph spoke without fear. He proposed a plan of action. Appoint a discerning and wise man to oversee the land. Collect 1/5 of the harvest during the years of abundance. Store grain in cities, and preserve it for the coming famine. His words carried weight not because of authority, but because of coherence. The plan was practical, disciplined, and urgent. Pharaoh recognized it immediately. In Joseph, Pharaoh saw something his counselors lacked: on intelligence, but integrity, wisdom without ambition, confidence without entitlement. The question Pharaoh asked revealed his decision before it was spoken. Can we find anyone like this, a man in whom is the Spirit of God? The answer was clear. Pharaoh elevated Joseph in a single day. The chains of the dungeon were replaced by the symbols of power. He was clothed in fine linen, adorned with a gold chain, and given Pharaoh's signet ring authority to act in the king's name. He was placed second in command over all Egypt. From prisoner to governor, no appeal, no delay, no negotiation. Joseph, once sold for silver, now controlled the wealth of a nation. Pharaoh gave him an Egyptian named Zaphanath-Paneah, a wife, Asenath, daughter of a priest of On. Joseph was 30 years old. 13 years had passed since he was sold into slavery. 13 years of descent, obscurity, and preparation had converged into one irreversible ascent. But Joseph did not celebrate. Scripture does not record triumph in his voice, nor amazement in his posture. He moved immediately into responsibility. Power did not intoxicate him, it activated him. The years of abundance began exactly as foretold. The land produced an overwhelming measure. Under Joseph's oversight, grain was gathered and stored until it could no longer be measured. Cities became centers of preservation. What others consumed freely, Joseph guarded carefully. He did not confuse abundance with permanence. When the famine came, it came everywhere. Not only Egypt, but the surrounding lands were affected. Crops failed, resources vanished, desperation spread. Yet Egypt endured not because of fortune, but because of foresight. People came from distant regions to buy grain. Egypt became a refuge, and Joseph became the gatekeeper of survival. He opened the storehouses methodically. He distributed according to need and order. His leadership was firm but fair. He had learned discipline under oppression. He did not hoard power. He exercised it. Meanwhile, far away in Canaan, Jacob's household felt the famine's pressure. Food ran out. Fear returned. The same sons who once sold their brother now faced the slow erasure of survival. Jacob heard that there was grain in Egypt. He sent his sons except Benjamin to buy food. He did not know he was sending them back into the orbit of the son they had betrayed. The path of reconciliation was being prepared without their awareness. Joseph was now a ruler among foreigners. His language, appearance, and authority concealed his identity. When his brothers stood before him, they did not recognize him. They bowed. The dreams had returned, but Joseph did not reveal himself. This was not vengeance, it was discernment. Joseph needed to know whether the men before him were still governed by jealousy or whether suffering had reshaped them as it had reshaped him. The test of power had arrived. Joseph had been elevated, but his heart remained under examination. He had authority to destroy or redeem. He could settle the past in a moment or unfold it carefully toward healing. The famine would force repeated encounters. The story was no longer about survival alone. It was about transformation. Joseph, once a slave sold by his brothers, now held their lives in his hands, and he chose patience, because destiny was not complete until forgiveness became possible. The brothers stood before Joseph without knowing it was him. They bowed low, just as the dream long ago had shown, though its meaning was now buried beneath hunger and fear. To them, this Egyptian governor was distant, severe, unrecognizably. To Joseph, the moment was overwhelming. Years of memories surged forward fields of QAnon, a coat torn from his shoulders, the darkness of a pit, the cold clink of silver exchanged for his life. Everything converged in this single encounter. Joseph recognized them instantly. Time had marked them, but not erased them. Their faces carried age, strain, and caution. They were no longer the confident sons of Jacob who once spoke easily of murder and profit. These men had been pressed by famine, driven from home by necessity. Yet Joseph did not rush toward revelation. Recognition did not mean reconciliation. Power demanded restraint. Joseph spoke harshly. It was intentional, not cruelty, but strategy. He accused them of being spies, enemies of the land. The words unsettled them. Fear rose quickly. Authority, when unexpected, strips people to their core. Joseph watched carefully not for answers, but for reactions. How would they respond when threatened? Would they fracture, deflect, blame, sacrifice one another as they had once sacrificed him? The brothers protested. They spoke of their father, of their family, of the youngest brother left behind. They insisted they were honest men. When Joseph heard them mention their father, something tightened within him. Jacob was still alive. Benjamin still lived. The family had not collapsed entirely. Joseph pressed harder. He demanded proof of their honesty. One brother would be imprisoned while the others returned home to bring the youngest brother back to Egypt. Only then would their words be believed. This demand was deliberate. Joseph was not seeking information. He was reopening the past, forcing the brothers into a situation where loyalty, not survival, would be tested. They spoke among themselves, not knowing Joseph understood their language. They said what they had never confessed aloud before, that this suffering was punishment for what they had done to Joseph. They remembered his cries from the pit. They acknowledged their guilt. Joseph turned away and wept. This was the first crack in the wall he had built around his heart. Their words revealed something had changed. Guilt had lived with them all these years. The past had not been buried. It had waited. Still, Joseph did not relent. He imprisoned Simeon before their eyes and sent the others back with grain. Secretly, he returned their silver to their sacks. This act carried multiple meanings. It ensured their return. It awakened fear. It echoed the past silver again, connected to betrayal and survival. On the journey home, the brothers discovered the money. Instead of relief, terror seized them. "What is this that God has done to us?" they said. They did not accuse one another. They did not celebrate gain. They recognized divine involvement. This too, Joseph would later weigh. When they returned to Jacob and told him everything, grief rose again. Jacob refused to send Benjamin. He had already lost Joseph. Simeon was now gone. Benjamin was the last living son of Rachel. Fear ruled him. Time passed. The grain ran out. Hunger has a way of reopening closed doors. Judah stepped forward. This time, not Reuben. Judah took responsibility. He pledged his own life for Benjamin's safety. He spoke not as a rival brother, but as a guarantor. Jacob relented. When they returned to Egypt with Benjamin, Joseph saw him. The sight of his younger brother, the only other son of Rachel, nearly undid him. He had to withdraw again to weep. But still, he waited. Love alone could not finish this story. Change had to be proven. Joseph welcomed them to his house. He released Simeon. He ordered a feast. The brothers were seated according to birth order, an impossible detail that unsettled them deeply. They knew they were being observed, weighed, tested. Benjamin's portion was 5 times larger than the others. Joseph watched carefully. Would jealousy return? Would resentment flare? Would Benjamin be resented as Joseph once had been? But nothing happened. No anger, no protest. They ate together, they drank freely, yet one test remained. Joseph ordered his silver cup as personal cup to be hidden in Benjamin's sack. As the brothers departed, Joseph sent his steward after them with accusation. The cup was found. Judgment was declared. Benjamin would remain as a slave. The others were free to go. This was the final test. The situation mirrored the past exactly. One favored son, one at risk, the rest given the option to walk away. This time they did not. Judah stepped forward. His speech was not defensive, it was sacrificial. He spoke of their father's grief, of the bond between Jacob and Benjamin, of the promise he himself had made. He offered himself in Benjamin's place, not as rhetoric, as reality. Joseph could not contain himself. The test was complete. The brothers were no longer the men who had sold him. They were willing to suffer rather than betray. Responsibility had replaced rivalry. Love had displaced envy. Joseph sent everyone else out of the room. The moment of revelation had arrived. The room fell silent when Joseph ordered every Egyptian attendant to leave. Doors closed. Footsteps faded. What remained was a chamber heavy with breath, memory, and the unbearable nearness of truth. 11 brothers stood before the most powerful man in Egypt, unaware that the distance between them was about to collapse. Joseph could no longer restrain himself. Years of discipline, authority, and restraint gave way in a flood of emotion. His voice broke. He wept so loudly that his cries echoed through the palace corridors. Even outside the room, Egyptians heard the sound and wondered. Inside, the brothers froze. This governor who had spoken with such measured severity now wept like a man undone. Then Joseph spoke. "I am Joseph." The words struck like thunder. At first, the brothers could not respond. Their minds rejected what their ears had heard. Joseph, the brother they had betrayed, the boy they had stripped, the one they had sold into slavery, stood alive before them, clothed in power. Fear seized them, not fear of discovery, but fear of consequence. If Joseph was truly Joseph, then judgment had finally arrived. Joseph repeated himself. "I am Joseph, your brother, whom you sold into Egypt." There was no accusation in his tone, no raised voice, only truth, undeniable, final. The brothers were dismayed, trembling in his presence. Years ago, they had stood over him with control of his fate. Now the roles were reversed beyond imagination. Joseph saw their terror and moved toward mercy. "Do not be distressed," he said. "Do not be angry with yourselves." These words carried impossible weight. This was not denial of the past. It was interpretation of it. Joseph reframed history itself. He told them God had sent him ahead to preserve life. What they meant for evil, God had used for good. Not despite their betrayal, but through it. This was not naive optimism. Joseph did not minimize their sin. He placed it inside a larger sovereignty. The pit, the chains, the prison, the years of waiting, none of it had been wasted. God had been present in every unseen step, shaping an outcome no one could have imagined. Joseph wept again and embraced Benjamin. Then he embraced the others. The brothers wept with him. This was not a neat reconciliation. It was a collision of grief and grace. Forgiveness did not erase memory. It redeemed it. Joseph did not forget the past. He overcame it by refusing to let it define the future. Only after this moment could conversation begin. Joseph told them to return quickly to Canaan and bring their father and households to Egypt. There was still famine ahead. Survival depended on proximity to provision. Joseph promised land, protection, and care. Pharaoh himself affirmed the invitation when he heard the news. The power Joseph held was not threatened by family, it was strengthened by it. The brothers departed with gifts, provisions, and instructions, but Joseph added one final word: do not quarrel on the way. He knew human nature. Guilt seeks someone to blame. Joseph refused to allow the old patterns to resurrect. When the brothers arrived in Canaan and told Jacob that Joseph was alive, the old man's heart nearly failed him. At first, he could not believe it. The story contradicted years of mourning, but when he saw the wagons from Egypt, his spirit revived. Hope returned where death had reigned. "I will go and see him before I die," Jacob said. The journey to Egypt was not just geographic, it was generational. A family fractured by favoritism and jealousy was moving toward restoration. God spoke to Jacob along the way, assuring him that Egypt, once a place of fear, would become a place of growth, not extinction. When Jacob arrived, Joseph went to meet him. The reunion defied language. Father and son embraced and wept for a long time. No explanation was needed. The past had already spoken enough. Presence now said everything. Joseph introduced his family to Pharaoh. He settled them in Goshen, fertile and protected. Israel multiplied there, just as God had promised long before to Abraham. What began as betrayal became the foundation of a nation, yet Joseph's story was not finished. Years later, Jacob died. After his burial, the brothers' fear returned. Without their father's presence, they assumed Joseph's forgiveness might expire. They came to him again, offering themselves as servants. Old wounds reopened easily. Joseph wept once more. "Do not fear," he said. "Am I in the place of God?" With these words, Joseph closed the final door to vengeance. He repeated the truth that defined his life. What they intended for harm, God intended for good. Forgiveness was not a moment, it was a posture. Joseph chose it again. He provided for them and their children. He spoke kindly. He acted consistently. Forgiveness was not proven by words alone, but by sustained mercy. Joseph lived to see multiple generations. Before his death, he spoke of the future of God's promise to bring Israel out of Egypt. He asked that his bones be carried back to the land God had sworn to give their fathers. Even in death, Joseph looked forward. His life stood as testimony that suffering does not negate calling, that betrayal does not cancel destiny, that forgiveness is not weakness but authority. Joseph ruled Egypt without bitterness. He reconciled his family without denial. He trusted God without reservation. The boy in the pit became the man who preserved nations. The dream was fulfilled. The famine did not end quickly. It lingered like a long shadow over the ancient world, pressing nations to their limits. Egypt survived not because of chance, but because Joseph's vision had been shaped long before abundance arrived. In these years, Joseph's authority reached its fullest expression not in dramatic ascent, but in sustained responsibility. Power once seized is tested not by triumph, but by endurance. As the famine deepened, people from every surrounding land came to Egypt for grain. The storehouses Joseph had filled during the years of plenty now opened steadily, not recklessly. He controlled distribution with precision, ensuring survival without collapse. The systems he designed did more than feed bodies. They reshaped the structure of Egyptian society. Land, livestock, and labor passed into Pharaoh's authority through Joseph's administration. Some would later question the cost of this consolidation, but in that moment it preserved life on a massive scale. Joseph stood at the center of this transformation, calm and resolute. He did not exploit desperation for personal gain. His wealth did not multiply at the expense of his integrity. Instead, he functioned as a steward answerable to Pharaoh in title, but to God in conscience. This was the quiet miracle of Joseph's life. He never confused power with ownership. Everything he managed belonged to a higher purpose. Meanwhile, in the land of Goshen, his family flourished. Israel settled into Egypt not as captives, but as guests protected, provisioned, and respected because of Joseph. Jacob lived 17 years in Egypt, long enough to see his family secure and multiplied. Before his death, Jacob gathered his sons and spoke prophetic words over each of them. When he came to Joseph, his blessing was rich, poetic and deep, acknowledging the suffering Joseph had endured and the strength he had displayed. Jacob died with peace. Joseph mourned him with honor befitting both a son and a statesman. The procession that carried Jacob's body back to Canaan was vast and solemn, witnessed by Egyptians who had come to respect the family through Joseph. Even in death, Jacob's journey testified to God's promise. Egypt was not the final home. The land sworn to Abraham still waited. After Jacob's burial, time passed, seasons turned. The famine eventually loosened its grip. Fields recovered. Life resumed rhythms, less desperate. But Joseph did not relinquish his discipline when crisis faded. Order remained. Wisdom endured beyond emergency. True leadership, Joseph knew, was not reactive, it was consistent. As years unfolded, Joseph watched his children grow, and his children's children after them. He saw the early shape of a nation forming within a foreign land. Israel was prospering, but Joseph understood something others might miss. Prosperity in exile can become dangerous if it dulls memory. Comfort has a way of disguising captivity. Joseph never forgot who he was. He dressed as an Egyptian, spoke their language, and governed their systems, but his identity was anchored elsewhere. The God of his fathers remained central to his thinking. Every success he experienced had been filtered through one conviction. God had brought him here for a reason, and God would one day bring his people out. That belief did not fade with age. As Joseph approached the end of his life, he gathered his brothers and their households. The man who had once been sold as property now spoke with the authority of a patriarch. He reminded them of God's promise, not vaguely, but with certainty. Egypt was temporary. Their future lay beyond its borders. God will surely visit you, Joseph said. This was not speculation, it was faith grounded in history. Joseph had seen God turn betrayal into salvation, chains into authority, famine into preservation. The same God he knew would fulfill what had been spoken generations before. Joseph made them swear an oath. When God brings you out of this land, carry my bones with you. It was a strange request by human standards, but profoundly theological. Joseph's burial instructions were an act of hope. He did not ask for a monument in Egypt or a tomb of honor. He asked to belong to the promise. His body would wait, even in death, for the future God had declared. Joseph died at the age of 110. Egypt mourned him. This was no small detail. The empire grieved a Hebrew leader because his wisdom had preserved their lives. Few foreigners in ancient history earned such honor. Joseph's life had bridged world's Hebrew faith and Egyptian power without losing allegiance to either responsibility or belief. Yet Joseph's death marked a quiet end of an era. He left behind no throne, no dynasty of kings, no political lineage. What he left was more enduring, a memory of faithfulness, a testimony that suffering, when entrusted to God, does not destroy, it defines it. His body was embalmed and placed in a coffin in Egypt, and there it remained. Years passed. Generations multiplied. Joseph's name slowly receded into story, then into heritage. Egypt changed. New kings arose who did not know Joseph. The favor once extended to Israel would one day turn into fear, then oppression. The land of refuge would become a land of bondage. But Joseph's bones waited. They waited through silence, through slavery, through the cries of the oppressed, through centuries of unanswered prayers. They waited because Joseph believed something beyond his lifetime. His hope was not anchored in what he saw, but in what God had sworn. When Moses would eventually lead Israel out of Egypt centuries later, Scripture records a small but powerful detail. They carried Joseph's bones with them. The promise was remembered. Joseph's life did not end with his death. It extended into the Exodus, into covenant fulfillment, into the identity of a nation learning, again and again, that God keeps his word even when fulfillment takes generations. Joseph never returned to Canaan alive, but he went home all the same. Joseph's story does not end with a throne, a crown, or a final victory speech. It ends in quiet faith. A coffin in Egypt, bones waiting for a promise not yet fulfilled. And in that stillness, the full weight of his life comes into focus. To understand Joseph, one must look backward, not to his power, but to his beginning. He was a favored son in a divided household, marked early by a love that isolated him. His coat, a symbol of distinction, became the first spark of hatred. Dreams followed visions of elevation spoken too soon, two hearts not ready to hear them. Joseph did not understand at the time that revelation without maturity can provoke resistance rather than faith. His youth was sincere, but incomplete. The pit was his first teacher. Stripped of identity, voice, and protection, Joseph learned what many never do, that destiny is not destroyed by betrayal. When his brothers sold him, they believed they were ending his future. In truth, they were unknowingly escorting him toward it. The caravan that carried him away also carried him forward. Slavery in Egypt refined what favor in Canaan could not. In Potiphar's house, Joseph learned discipline. Faithfulness in obscurity replaced the comfort of privilege. His integrity was tested not by abundance, but by temptation. When he refused Potiphar's wife, he lost everything against status, safety, and freedom. Obedience cost him, and the prison became his second pit. Yet even there, God was not absent. Joseph's greatest strength was not his ability to interpret dreams, but his refusal to let injustice corrupt his soul. He did not grow bitter. He did not abandon faith. He served where he was placed. In chains, he practiced leadership. In confinement, he cultivated trust. Time became his longest trial. Forgotten by men, Joseph waited while years passed without explanation. The silence did not mean abandonment, it meant preparation. When Pharaoh finally called for him, Joseph emerged not as a desperate prisoner, but as a composed servant of God. He gave God credit openly, without fear of consequence. This was not ambition, it was alignment. Elevation came suddenly, but it did not change him. Joseph governed Egypt with wisdom shaped by suffering. He knew hunger, so he prepared for famine. He knew loss, so he valued preservation. He knew powerlessness, so he used power to sustain life, not to exploit it. His leadership saved nations, but it was his character that preserved his soul. Then came the ultimate test. When the brothers who betrayed him stood before him, Joseph held their fate in his hands. This was the moment the past demanded resolution. Vengeance would have been easy, justified, even expected. But Joseph chose something higher. He chose interpretation over accusation. "You meant it for evil," he said, "but God meant it for good." These words did not excuse sin, they revealed sovereignty. Joseph understood that God does not merely repair damage, he weaves it into purpose. Forgiveness, for Joseph, was not emotional release. It was theological clarity. God was bigger than the betrayal. Joseph's reconciliation with his family did not erase the past, it redeemed it. The wounds remained part of the story, but they no longer defined the ending. In choosing mercy, Joseph broke a generational cycle of deception, favoritism, and violence that had haunted his family since its earliest days. His life became a bridge. Through Joseph, Israel entered Egypt, not as captives, but as a protected people. Through Joseph, Egypt survived a famine that could have destroyed it. Through Joseph, the promises made to Abraham moved one step closer to fulfillment, even though fulfillment would come centuries later. Joseph did not live to see the Exodus, but he believed in it. His final request that his bones be carried out of Egypt was not symbolic nostalgia. It was a declaration of faith that outlived him. Joseph trusted God beyond his own lifespan. He understood that obedience is not always rewarded immediately, but it is always remembered. When Moses later carried Joseph's bones through the wilderness, it was more than a burial detail. It was the echo of a life that trusted God through silence, suffering, and delay. Joseph's story teaches that God's plans are often concealed within pain. The pit is not the end. The prison is not proof of failure. Delay is not denial. Joseph never controlled his circumstances, but he controlled his response. That was the true source of his authority. He did not rise because he was clever. He rose because he was faithful when no one was watching. In a world obsessed with instant vindication, Joseph stands as a witness to long obedience. In a culture that equates power with dominance, Joseph reveals power as stewardship. In a history filled with broken families, Joseph shows that forgiveness is not forgetting, it is choosing the future over the past. The boy who dreamed became the man who trusted. The slave who suffered became the ruler who served. The betrayed brother became the preserver of life. And when his life finally ended, it did not close a chapter, it completed a testimony. Joseph's life was never about Egypt, it was never about the throne, it was never about revenge or reward. It was about a God who sees, a God who waits, a God who redeems, from the pit to the promise. Joseph's story declares one enduring truth: God is at work even when the dream seems buried. Joseph's story does not end with a throne, nor with applause, nor even with victory. It ends with faith. A coffin in Egypt. Joseph teaches us that the pit is not the end, that the prison is not God's rejection, and that delay does not cancel destiny. He shows us that forgiveness is not weakness, but authority, that power is not proven by revenge, but by mercy, and that God's purposes move forward even through pain. Long after Joseph was gone, his bones would be carried toward the promised land, a silent testimony that God never forgets his word. And so his life asks us a question: will we trust God when the dream is buried? Will we remain faithful when no one remembers our name? Because the same God who lifted Joseph from the pit is still at work today, turning suffering into purpose, and silence into salvation. This has been a story from Legends of the Bible. If this message moved you, remember to like, subscribe, and share, and join us again as we uncover the next life, the next mystery, and the next truth hidden within the pages of Scripture.